Last year, I returned to the place where I spent 3 of the most important months of my life.
Hello. Nice to meet you. The park garden. As you can see, let's have a seat. How was your trip?
Excellent. Very good trip.
Okay. So you will stay a few days?
We'll stay a few days here, and we're hoping to go to group 13. God, it's a long walk.
It's a long walk. It's changing every day, but for the moment it's a long walk. But it's a good group. We start to habituate to the group 5 years ago, and now it's one of our best groups. So when did you come the first time?
I came 13 years ago, 1971, and I worked in Karasoke.
And what kind of work did you do there?
I was making observations of the life of the gorillas, and I've been developing the ideas since. Gorillas once ranged widely over this part of Africa. Now there are only a few hundred mountain gorillas left, living precariously on the slopes of the Virunga volcanoes. As more and more land has been claimed for agriculture, the gorilla's natural habitat has been drastically reduced. In the past, poachers also have taken their toll. Now the gorillas are monitored and protected by wardens of the Mountain Gorilla Project.
Yes, I cover Visoki, Karisimbi.
So how long have you been here?
2.5 years now. Mark is the next area over there.
It was in a hut like this on the slopes of Mount Visoki that I lived and worked when I was here before. I had a particular reason for being here. A few weeks before, a family of gorillas had been killed by poachers. 8 bodies had been brought back to the camp. Gorillas are precious to science, even in death. My job was to remove the flesh from the bones, reassemble the skeletons, and make measurements of the bones and the skulls for a laboratory in Cambridge. For company, I had this chimpanzee. She didn't belong up here in the mountains any more than I did, but she'd been rescued from a dealer, and for the time being, there was nowhere else for her to go. So she and I shared the hut.
It's a standard Rwandan house, this.
Did you build it yourself? The skulls were the first reason why I'd come. But I had another motive for wanting to get out here.
Yes, that was my innovation. It's too cold to be...
I'd been working for 7 years as an experimental psychologist, based in a laboratory, and I was beginning to question the direction I was going. I'd never doubted, and still don't, that psychology, the scientific study of the mind, ought to be the most exciting and challenging branch of all the sciences. I studied at the Psychological Laboratory at Cambridge. I took my degree there in 1964 and stayed on to do research. I was working mainly with monkeys, exploring the brain mechanisms involved in their capacity for seeing. I began giving lectures and publishing scientific papers. Vision in monkeys after removal of the striate cortex. Responses to visual stimuli of units in the superior colliculus of rats and monkeys. Size constancy in monkeys with inferotemporal lesions. Research on the machinery of the brain is difficult and fascinating. It feels like, and it is, I suppose, real science, But is it really, I'd begun to wonder, what psychology is about? I was less and less convinced that research on the mechanics of the brain would ever produce a satisfactory account of the nature and origins of higher mental processes. And there was something else. If you're going to study the brains of living animals, you have to have a special sort of scientific detachment, and I didn't have it. The brain, even the brain of a rat, is a very beautiful thing, immensely well designed and finely put together. If you're going to destroy it in order to uncover its secrets, you'd better be pretty confident of what you're doing, and I wasn't anymore. I wanted to work at a level which would make more sense to me. I returned to Cambridge in 1970, but this time not to the psychological laboratory, but to the sub-department of animal behavior at Madingley. There I came across, for the first time, a new kind of scientist, whose roots lay not in experimental psychology, but in zoology and natural history. Ethologists, as they're called, study the behavior of animals and people, first of all, in a state of nature, in the wild. They see the brain and the mind not simply as complex pieces of machinery, which just happen to exist, but as organs of survival, adapted through a long history of evolution to meet the particular needs of the particular animal in its environment. Madingley had given me a new way of looking at animal behavior, and it was from there that I'd come to Africa. When I'd completed the work with the skulls, I went on to study the animals themselves. I'd get up with the sun, follow the gorillas' trail from their resting place the night before, and join them for the day's activity. I was in an unusual position. A laboratory psychologist, now given the opportunity to do fieldwork. It was up there I became interested in a philosophical and scientific puzzle which has kept me thinking ever since.
Yes, group 9 is right in this area, and there's a possibility of an interaction between the two groups.
These days, for reasons of safety, no one attempts to make contact on their own. Nemeye is a skilled tracker and park guard. Mark Condiotti, one of the Mountain Gorilla Project scientists. Gorillas seldom range more than a mile or so each day. They know their own territory well and seldom leave it, unless they've been scared by human poachers, or perhaps been upset by a hostile encounter with another group from the next valley. Group 13 had been seen the previous day making tracks over the border into Zaire. But the hope was that they'd now have turned round and be back near a home in the bamboos.
So which animal is that? That's Murray. He's the solo dog. He's the sort of leader of the group.
Yeah. He's 60 years old.
Sounds quite young.
Yeah.
How many other animals in the group are there?
There are another 9. It's about a normal composition.
Mirithi decides which way the group will travel, where they'll feed and camp. If danger threatens, either from other gorillas or from human beings, it's he who will leap to their defense. Zahabu is Marithi's senior wife. He has 4 others. There are 3 youngsters in the group. Two sons, aged 3 and 4, and Kampanga, a daughter just over a year old. Gorillas typically live in family groups about this size. Their daily routine is simple and predictable. Up from their night nests, not too early in the morning. Off to some known patch where food is plentiful. A period of feeding, a rest in the sun, travel a bit further, feed again, and then on to a suitable campsite where they construct nests of branches and leaves. As you can see, it's not a bad life. In fact, it seems remarkably easy. Too easy. It was that fact which seemed to me to require some kind of explanation. Gorillas have very large brains, not proportionately as large as a man's, but larger relative to their body than any other land animal except the chimpanzee. Gorillas, one would guess, must correspondingly be animals of very high intelligence. What were they doing with those brains, that intelligence? In the laboratory, psychologists have shown that gorillas, and equally chimpanzees, can do all sorts of extremely clever things. Intelligence means reasoning ability. These animals can use their mental skills to solve practical problems like these, joining 2 sticks together to retrieve a banana, undoing a lock to open a door, they can also, in the lab, solve difficult conceptual puzzles, put things together in their heads, and even gain mastery over a machine by learning and manipulating its symbolic language. The more psychologists have tested them, the more impressed they've been. And not surprisingly, it's been taken for granted that the intelligence on display in the laboratory must also be being used in some way in the wild. The reality I now saw in front of me was, however, obviously and perplexingly different. Here in the forest, there was no sign of the gorillas using their intelligence. Hard as I looked, I never saw them do anything which struck me as being clever, let alone were they having to solve difficult conceptual problems. Indeed, what problems were there? Life for the gorillas seemed so simple. Food abundant and easy to gather, provided they knew where to find it. No real danger from predators, provided they knew how to avoid them.
If you think in evolutionary terms, you're bound to be puzzled when you come across something in nature. You don't know what it's for. Darwin's theory suggests that little, if anything, exists in nature without a reason. The shapes, the forms, the faculties of plants and animals have evolved because, and only because, they contribute in some way to the animal's biological survival. It's no more likely that a gorilla would have evolved a large and complex brain without gaining some kind of biological advantage from it, than that a bird would have developed wings without the need to fly.
Suppose you did come across a bird with wings which, while you watched, didn't seem to fly. You wouldn't for that reason reject Darwin's theory. You'd guess, at least you'd hope, that the error was your own, not evolution's. But if the gorillas didn't need such large brains, if apparently they could survive quite well without them, the question was, why did they have them? The problem wasn't just a psychological one, it was a biological and evolutionary one. There must, I thought, be more to this apparently uncomplicated lifestyle than I was recognizing. I tried to put myself in the gorilla's place and to imagine what would claim my attention and concern in day-to-day life. Then suddenly, I saw the scene with quite new eyes. I realized that if I was a gorilla, the area of my life which would certainly matter to me most would be the whole area of my social relationships with the other animals around me. The reason why life in the forest apparently poses so few problems for these apes is precisely because the gorilla family, as a social unit, is so well adapted to it. An ape brought up under the care of others, protected while he's young, shown the ways of the forest. He won't have much problems in coping with the outside world. Among higher primates, the social group provides a kind of polytechnic school where survival skills, tricks of the trade, can be passed on. This young chimpanzee is learning by imitation to use a leaf as a sponge to soak up water. This animal has learned by copying an older chimpanzee how to adapt a stick to fish for termites. It's possible for an ape culture to be transmitted in this way because the family unit provides such stability and continuity. But stable family groups don't just happen. They have to be worked for. The social life of a gorilla may not look all that problematical, but that's only because the animals are so good at it. They know each other intimately. They know their place. There are endless small disputes about social dominance, about who grooms who, or who should have first access to a favorite food. Sometimes it's more serious. Major disagreements about who should mate with who should be turned out of the family, who admitted. If these family quarrels do not escalate calamitously, it's because the individual animals seem capable of understanding and relating to each other, employing social intelligence to defuse potentially dangerous situations. The ability to read another animal's behavior and adapt your own accordingly can be a matter of life and death. This young female chimpanzee has become separated from her group. She has a young infant. If they are to survive, she must gain the acceptance and protection of another group. She's been following these animals for several days. She begins a process of negotiation. She must read the signs correctly, weigh things up, and modify her own behavior in the light of the responses she receives. She gets it right and is accepted. The mother's social skill has saved the baby's life, and it's her skill which the baby itself will inherit and pass on. The intelligence on display here is something of quite a different order to that needed to cope with the material world. I'd begun by asking why the intelligence of the great apes evolved, what it could be for. Now I thought I knew. Social intelligence was the key to the great apes' biological survival. They were using their senses, memories, abstract intellectual skills at their limits when handling their relationships with one another. And this had been the chief reason for the evolution of their powerful brains. But if that was true for the great apes, couldn't the same be true for human beings themselves? It's not always safe or simple to apply the same reasoning to human beings as we apply to animals. Human beings are by no means merely naked chimpanzees. But we human beings did, in the relatively recent past, share a common ancestor with the great apes. We still share more than 98% of our genetic material with the gorilla and the chimpanzee. If we can ask evolutionary questions about the origins of intelligence and its relation to social life in apes, we ought to ask the same questions about man. Have people, too, evolved to be psychologists by nature? Is that what makes our families and our society work? We possess powers of language, creativity, and self-awareness, which, so far as we know, no other animal possesses. Our societies are infinitely richer and more complex than anything which exists elsewhere in nature. But perhaps these two things are connected. Human intelligence and human social systems have developed hand in hand. Homo sapiens, we call ourselves, wise men. We pride ourselves on our skill as toolmakers and engineers. But is that where human wisdom really lies?
that about an hour ago and we can't find it. Thank you very much.
London Airport. In a single year, 30 million passengers pass through the terminals.
There's something up there.
They're served by 45,000 airport and airline staff. A plane arrives or leaves every minute, 1,000 flight movements a day.
31A there, straight line on your right.
It's a miracle of technological achievement and human cooperation. Only human beings could do it. But is it simply our skill as technologists which makes it possible? We've become today so mechanically ingenious, so good at making things, that it's easy to forget all the other uses for our human minds. It's easy to be more impressed by people's ability to understand and operate machines than by their ability to understand and cooperate with one another. The fact is that all this can exist only because people work together to produce it, each of them coming from their own smaller social group, and each dependent on his or her own network of family and friends. If human beings have gone further than gorillas, they've done so not simply by developing an impersonal, mechanical intelligence, but by taking still further the art of relating to each other. The man who invented the sewing machine was a Shakespearean actor turned mechanic who became a multi-millionaire. He had 5 wives and 15 children. At one time, he kept 3 households going simultaneously, flitting from one to the other under 3 different names. Mr. Singer, it seems, was a success on several levels, a kind of human silverback. I wonder how much time he spent thinking about sewing machines and how much about the problems of relating to those wives. When I returned from that first trip to Rwanda, I was preoccupied by this idea of what I came to call natural psychology. If social intelligence was the key to the great apes' biological survival, couldn't the same be true at a higher level for man? But if that was right, it meant that almost all the earlier theories about what mattered in human evolution had got it upside down. 15 years ago, the talk was all of tool-making, spear-throwing and fire-lighting, practical rather than social intelligence. In 1976, I went to visit Richard Leakey at the site in northern Kenya where he and his team have been slowly uncovering man's earliest history. During the month I was there, Leakey unearthed one of the oldest and most complete of the early human skulls, a companion to the one he'd found a year before. I remember the touch of that skull. It made me wonder with a new intensity what kind of a person, emotionally and psychologically, this could have been. He dates from about 1.5 million years ago. In evolutionary terms, he's comparatively modern, no longer an ape, almost one of us. His brain was already twice the size of a gorilla's. His ancestors, some millions of years earlier, had made the break with the great apes. Why? What pressures or opportunities were the ancestors of human beings responding to? Africa, about 20 million years ago, was a much lusher place than it is now. Warm, steaming forests covered the continent, and in those forests lived the common ancestor of modern apes and man, a fruit-eating, tree-dwelling animal, about the size of a baboon. The climate changed. The forests began to thin out and retreat. Our ancestors came down onto the forest floor. Almost certainly, they began to be more socially dependent, and they grew larger-brained. Areas of sparsely treed grassland were developing. A new ecological niche was beckoning, attractive to those early apes, but too risky and difficult, too technically demanding to lure them from their traditional haven in the trees. But around 6 million years ago, the break was made. The ancestors of today's gorillas and chimpanzees stayed behind, while another group, the animals from which we are descended, took to the field. It was the parting of the ways. A new line of man-like animals evolved, with the bodies, and more importantly, the minds, which would allow them to survive and flourish as hunters and gatherers on the African savanna. The question is, what was the evolutionary development which made it possible? It's been argued that the crucial step in the journey from apes to man was our ancestor's ability to walk on his hind legs, or to eat and digest a wider range of grassland foods, or to manipulate and relate his fingers to his thumb, vital for a toolmaker and user. But if you think again about the nature of intelligence, about the expanding brain and its possible uses to those first hunter-gatherers, there's an answer, it seems to me, that's much more interesting. Not fingers to thumb, but person to person. The crucial step in human evolution would have been our ancestors' newfound ability to manipulate and relate himself in human ways to the other human beings around him. This gorilla has been brought up in a human household and treated in every way as a human baby. For the first few months, it develops and behaves like a human baby. But then, like a rerun of history, it begins to fall socially and mentally behind. The gorilla may come nearer to being human than any other animal except a chimpanzee, but the gorilla will never understand the nature of a human bargain, never be capable of learning the rules of any human game, never share, never swap roles. The gorilla's intelligence is sufficient, but no more, to cope with the life of a gorilla family in the forest. Our ancestors, however, could leave the forest precisely because they were capable of raising social life to a new plane. By 2 million years ago, there is evidence that the basic pattern of human social living was established. Human beings were living in small communal groups, centered round a home base. There was division of labor and sharing of food. Both mother and father helped rear the children. Subsistence skills were the property of the community and passed on by tradition. The social structure here was so far advanced on anything that exists amongst the other apes that it implies a quantum leap in the underlying psychological skills of the community. This man has been given the name Homo erectus because he stood on his 2 feet, but the name I'd give him is Homo psychologicus because inside that skull he must already have possessed the most ordinary and yet quite extraordinary human ability to sit down and share his life with other human beings. The Bushmen of the Kalahari may be biologically modern, but their lifestyle has not changed substantially in the last 1 million years. In many ways, these people's lives can provide a model for how the first men lived. Although apparently barren, the savanna, to those who know it, is a natural garden, and its secrets belong to the Bushmen, passed on from generation to generation. Women gather. Men go after meat with bow and spear. The boys have 15 years to learn the techniques of the hunter. Nothing is wasted. Everything turned to human use. Whoever first discovered how to weave, to cook, to cure, is long forgotten. No new technique has been invented within living memory. Inherited skills are the shared property of the community. Sharing is not simply a practical necessity. It's central to the bushman's whole philosophy of life. The community survives on a basis of trust and reciprocity, division of labor between the sexes and between generations. They may spend time apparently doing nothing, passing time in idle gossip. But this time spent socializing is as crucial to their survival as any time spent hunting or gathering in the field. For it's here that the social backbone of bushman society is laid down and, if necessary, repaired. Friendships established, problems talked out, plans hatched. Beneath the surface, there are, as everywhere with human beings, petty jealousies, domestic squabbles, suspicions of favoritism, infidelity, disruptive emotions that must be recognized and contained. As a strategy for human survival in a hostile environment, it works astonishingly well. But it works only because these people are, like all human beings, supremely good at reading one another's minds. For 1,000,000 years, this is how people lived. Until, with the coming of agriculture and human settlement, a new chapter of human history began. But that was as little as 10,000 years ago. In many respects, the society of the hunter-gatherers remains our own emotional and intellectual base. Today, we live in a world fashioned by the seemingly impersonal forces of recent history. Commerce, politics, religion, science.
Zulu 17.
Our society is immeasurably more complicated than that of our ancestors.
3376. You want to contact a Mr. Pulver at Palmolive House, 76 Oxford Street. You're going down to the South Bank.
Yet, in one crucial respect, nothing has changed. At home and at work, we, no less than the Bushmen of the Kalahari, have to be natural psychologists to survive. Last year, I returned to the place where I spent 3 of the most important months of my life.
No, ma poi quando la guarda che io oh, nice to meet you. The park garden, as you can just let's have a seat. How was your trip?
Excellent. Very good trip.
Okay. So you would stay a few days?
We'll stay a few days here, and we're hoping to go to Group 13. God, it's a long walk.
It's a long walk. It's changing every day, but for the moment it's long.
This could go wrong. Careless words. A joke pushed too far.
Oh, can't imagine how letters are going.
12 people here, balancing privacy with frankness, easiness with tolerance and respect, genuine concern with nosiness about each other's lives. It all depends on the taken-for-granted skill of human intuition.
Bromley North Station has been redeveloped.
As representative of the London Taxi Drivers Association, John has the difficult political task of representing their interests against other organisations in the city.
Rank in Bromley South. We should really look at Bromley North.
We meet with other trade organisations, members of both the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, who have the power to appoint ranks or make any alterations in ranks.
Because if they don't want to work there, Ron, I mean...
The work is there, we know that.
We know it's there. We're offering them the chance of a facility. You know, the only thing is that you're going to get egg on your face in view of the amount of negotiation that you entered into with British Rail.
Yeah, British Rail's the hardest people in the world, aren't they?
Everybody's organisation is ambitious and wants to be the major representative body, of course.
Yellow's off them.
Negotiation is a remarkable game. To win an argument, to get your way. It's not just a matter of being logical or sensible.
They say that if they don't want to set about moving the rank, they want to wait until it's public property and then leave it to the commissioner to appoint one.
It will never be public highway.
Of course it won't be public. You have to handle each person according to the thing that you want from them. You can't actually say to some people point blank, I want this, because you know that they are there to negotiate, which means to talk you down from a particular position. Hopefully we're going to get it resolved before...
We'll lose the income from it, John.
By taxis coming in, yes, I see that, but then surely...
It's a psychological art. When to push, when to hold back. Last year, I returned to the place where I spent 3 of the most important months of my life.
No, ma poi quando la guarda che io la guarda. Oh!
Secondo me.
Nice to meet you. The park garden, as you can see, let's have a seat. How was your trip?
Excellent. Very good trip.
Okay. So you will stay a few days?
We'll stay a few days here, and we're hoping to go to Group 13.